So, I thought this morning I would talk about the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre, and I can think of no better introduction to Sartre's philosophy than his brief anagram at the beginning of one of his plays, The Condemned of Altona. In that play, at the very outset, as I said, as a fragment or an anagram, Sartre makes this statement: 1 plus 1 equals 1. That's our mystery. And I think that in many ways the explication of that statement runs through much of Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy. So the work I want to begin with in terms of explicating what exactly Sartre means by this kind of mysterious formula, a meth, is the work by the incredible political philosopher Frantz Fanon. Sartre wrote the preface to that work, and it's powerful, and in typical Jean-Paul Sartre fashion, it cuts right to the matter. He talks in his preface about the co-optation of indigenous elites and how the alienation of the population, which followed from the pacification program undertaken by, in this case, the French in Algeria, led to this strange dynamic whereby indigenous elites identified with their colonial oppressors, something that was written about by numerous scholars over the years. And in Fanon's work, there are lots of truly breathtaking themes that he develops, and Sartre touches on several of them as he proceeds through his preface. There is one aspect of Sartre's introduction, though, that I think sheds light both on his own philosophy and the philosophy that was advanced by Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth. That observation concerns the relationship between the human psyche and political struggle, political violence in particular. Sartre speaks almost prophetically of the demoralizing and alienating effects of the French War of Pacification in Algeria. What is perhaps prophetic about it, though, is how the very attempt to pacify the population actually has the effect of radicalizing the population. If that sounds familiar, it is the very same caveat that many foreign policy analysts mentioned, continue to mention, about contemporary pacification programs, or the euphemism that's sometimes preferred, suppression programs. During the uptick in drone warfare in Afghanistan and Pakistan, for example, many scholars and commentators noted that this was having a secondary effect of radicalizing the very populations that U.S. sought to win over. So what Sartre is getting at in his preface is that the human psyche undertakes an adaptation which leads those who participate in it to become against it, to rebel against it, to become initially depressed and demoralized. Now, looking back on what both Fanon and Sartre are saying in this work, it's interesting to think about their words from the perspective of contemporary neuroscience, for example. There's been a tremendous amount of literature in the last couple of years about how trauma, political trauma, violent trauma, which are oftentimes the same, sadly, lead to fundamental changes in the brain. Lesions will appear on MRIs or CAT scans, which suggest a fairly clear-cut effect of before and after the exposure to the trauma. So it's not that difficult a leap from this observation to the question of what has happened to humanity as such as a result of endless wars of conquest, pacification, resistance. What is the generational residue of these earlier instances of violence? Can we trace the prevalence and the widespread appearance of mental illness in the contemporary world to these earlier episodes of violence in our collective history? In short, are wars today sowing the seeds of mental illness tomorrow? And can we work backwards and ask ourselves, well, if what we're seeing today is creating horrific trauma to the extent that many of our young men and women who are coming back from the theater suffer severe PTSD, even those who operate drone warfare instruments are exhibiting signs of PTSD. So if that's the case now, what can we infer about earlier wars? Certainly we are, if anything, as a species, remarkably resilient and adaptable. But have all these centuries of wars left their mark, distributed seemingly in a random way around the planet, on our fellow brothers and sisters, our friends, as mental illness? What is the role of political violence, earlier political violence, on our mental states? Now, towards the end of The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon provides some unbelievably powerful case studies of depression, catatonia, and all kinds of maladies that resulted from the war in Algeria, which Sartre is raising, and Fanon as well, a deeply disturbing question here, and that is a kind of historical connection between our existence today and what Sartre will later call the practico-inert of the past. Now, the practico-inert is a concept that he develops in his later work, but it basically refers to the ossified structures of previous power regimes on oppressed peoples, such that when we think of things like historical alienation, they continue to operate as a kind of a generational meme handed down from decade after decade. So these are the kind of questions that Sartre poses in his preface to the Wretched of the Earth. As I said, they're not questions. Certainly Sartre couldn't anticipate the amazing breakthroughs in research in neuropsychiatry. However, if we read The Wretched of the Earth from the perspective of what we know today about PTSD and neuropsychiatry, it is eye-popping in its breadth and in the disturbing consequences that it may portend for all of us. Thank you.